Conversation analysis. I just took a picture of this wonderful poster. It was very well done. So a lot of this information is very new for me because I just had the opportunity to go to this fantastic conference thanks to the money that they're giving lecturers. And I really learned a lot, and so I contacted a person. I went to a workshop all about teaching intercultural competence, and I asked if I could borrow his materials because they were so excellent, and what he's doing is something that really gave me a lot of food for thought, and I wanted to share this with everybody else too. So let's start with some definitions, because there's nothing more important than defining what we're talking about. And this is, for me, where I had to break down, because what is culture?
That's a really hard question.
Isn't it?
What's, like, values and stuff, kind of where you're from, in a way, or?
I think so. I don't think there's a wrong answer here. I'd like to put that. I'm not waiting for the one, because a lot of things fit under this culture umbrella.
Like, tradition.
Traditions. Yeah, we always start off our semester with asking students in the first year what cultural things they want to learn about. And it's always very superficial stuff, food, sports. But we're hoping to get deeper into that when we teach language. It's not just about learning how to say hello, it's about how do you say it and when and why and that kind of thing. So I just Googled image culture. This was the first thing that came up. I thought this, again, a lot of this is very superficial. The arts, food and drink. There's like values and traditions, and language is in here too, and all of these things. I mean, I think it's hard to define. It's like the word quality. I mean, somebody wrote an entire book about defining that. So dictionary.com, I looked here, and this is where I spent maybe 90% of getting ready for this talk, by the way, is just this rabbit hole of how we define culture. This is what dictionary.com says: an quality in a person or society that arises from a concern for what is regarded as excellent in arts, letters, manners, scholarly pursuits, etc. And then that was as excellent in the arts, manners, etc. Then they have a particular form or stage of civilization as that of a certain nation or period, Greek culture. And then development or improvement of the mind by education or training. I think all of this is absolute crap, and I don't buy into any of these definitions but I think that this is what many people see of when we say cultured, and this is what our students are dealing with. These are the definitions that they have of culture, and this is what we work with a lot too. And I was shocked to see this, because this is what our society has accepted as cultured, and so then what are we trying to teach when we teach intercultural competence if this is our mindset? I call this the museum problem, because we teaching about hobbies, then we ask students, like, what's your favorite hobby? And they write in English, then we translate it for them, and then one student said their favorite hobby was going to museums. That's like their favorite hobby. And then we eventually get out of the union where we talk about hobbies, and I was able to translate that, and then I asked her, like, what is your favorite museum? They couldn't answer, because the truth was they'd never actually been to a museum. They just wrote what they thought I wanted to hear. And also, too, we have this idea that museums, like, this is where we house our culture, and this is a cultural place. And then there's also, like, the issue of this being guarded because you have to pay to get in, and then the mobility issue, and all these other things, too, that go along with it. So I think about this a lot, like this idea that this is somehow, the Albuquerque Museum is our culture. It's behind closed doors, you have to pay to go see it. Again, this is, I think, a lot of times what students, and to a certain extent instructors, think of when they think of culture. So the following slides, I want to say, I didn't write these next ones. They're taken from Ingrid Pillar's work on intercultural communication, not from me. So she talks about culture as a national asset. So high culture, like the museums, right? The history, the arts, theater, music, when we talk about being cultured, this is what sometimes some people tend to think of. There's popular or pop culture, folklore and customs, handicraft, traditional clothing, cuisine, music. She used the word traditional costume, which really bothered me. I don't think that's appropriate. And I read this interesting article too recently about how we have fine arts and then we have arts and crafts, and they're separate. And partially because in Western history, women were barred from doing the fine arts. They couldn't paint and anything like this. So what women did, embroidery, that's like crafts. That's something else. So it's interesting too, like even in this intercultural communication book, that she separates it as like the high art and then the pop culture, as if one is somehow better than the other. Yeah.
I think it may be like related to class, because like fine arts are like more privileged and crafts are like everyday things, so it kind of separates it.
Yeah, and then she mentions history here, which is again, I think a gatekeeping issue because you have to learn about it and who can learn. I mean, people only can afford to go to school, and then like theater is very, very expensive, as I found out recently in New York. I mean, again, there's like this issue of gatekeeping, and then this folklore and customs and this other stuff that's for everybody. Somehow this is, yeah, this class issue, which I don't buy into personally, but I mean, I think this is how some people define culture and do see it as separate. And then there's country facts, because if you want to visit a country, you go to their website, and like there's a list of cultural stuff, like the flag, the national language. America, by the way, doesn't have a national language. There's no official language here. Money, what currency is used, newspapers, what kind of the most popular newspapers. I think that's fading quite a bit with the age of digital media and that kind of thing. Radio stations too. You can listen to radio. TV, again, I think a lot of these, like, you can tell this is aging a little bit, but this is the idea, like what was popular and what is, and this is this culture. And then culture is challenged, which she puts up, which I thought was really interesting. And then she defines this as like business hours, when are things open? Tipping, how much to tip and do you and should you? Public holidays. I don't understand how this title is challenged. I didn't really understand that from her book. Does anybody have any insights?
I don't know, maybe it's because not everybody, when you have a public holiday, not everybody actually gets a holiday.
Right.
I don't know.
Maybe that, yeah. Business hours aren't the same, maybe. We don't all tip 20%. Even though it's like become a standard now. I mean, yeah, maybe this is the idea, is that these ideas can be challenged. But I thought they were interesting too, because we do think of this. Like in Australia, people complain about the service at restaurants because there's no tipping there, so they don't feel the need to have excellent service. That's one argument I've heard, I don't actually know. But in any case, it's also culture as interpersonal relationships and nonverbal communication, which is what we think of a lot of times when we teach languages. Nonverbal aspects of reading, dress codes, grooming, which I thought was interesting that she mentioned this. Like, I don't think of grooming, maybe as much as I should, I guess. Anyways, physical proximity, how close you are to another person when you talk to them. Conversation pacing, like how does the conversation go? So when I worked in the Army, for instance, and we'd be listening to conversations, like it would be a 5-minute conversation, but maybe the first 4 minutes would be just greeting each other, because that's the normal pacing. And then eventually you get around to what you really wanted to say. And we don't really do that in America. Gift giving. The culture of gifts. I have a friend who lives in Japan, and boy, a lot of money is spent on gift giving, and there's a lot of social rules that go around with this that I'm figuring out. Culture is citizenship. So it practices seen as signifying a particular identity. It's like American culture, or gender norms, for instance, and should we use different pronouns now, relationship norms, what your sexuality is, can you be bi, trans, and these things. And then we have culture as a weapon to discriminate, because we can say like clothing, like the debates over the hijab, is this culture or religious choice, or can you do this and that's not American, get that thing out of your head, just like my grandma always used to say. Right, demands to learn our language, whatever that is. It's a part of our citizenship test now in America, you have to have an English portion. Demands to integrate into our society, whatever that is. To conform to a gender or sexuality norm, again, whatever this is. So we can use this idea of culture as this weapon of discrimination, which I think Trump did a fantastic job of winning the election, really. This idea of us versus them, and as if that changes when you go across a border. But here's the biggest issue. All of this presupposes that culture is this thing that exists. So the culture is homogenous, so we can talk about Arab culture, or American culture, or Chinese culture, anything as if this is this one set body thing that is based on a nation state, these very firm borders that happen. So for instance, this causes problems in teaching Arabic, because this is where Arabic is spoken. So people that talk about Arab culture or Middle Eastern culture as if it's the same from Morocco to Iraq. That's not the case at all. It's an entire spans 2.5 continents. So it becomes a real problem. That's not like suddenly we go south here and like you're very different if you cross this border here. That's not what's going to happen. But because Arabic is an official language, people tend to block out this area in their minds as this, as if it's all the same. So when we teach culture in the language classroom, I say we assume, but Heather assumed, like we know what culture is, and then students know what culture is, and that those definitions are the same. And then when we try to teach intercultural competence, we assume even more, because it's one of those buzzwords that everybody uses, but like we know what that means. And students know what their own culture is in order to have that cross-cultural or intercultural competence. And that also students knowingly apply this knowledge in the language classroom. So for instance, if I say something like, a lot of women wear the hijab in the Middle East, but not all, it's a very physical form of culture. But I assume that people like know what the hijab is, or that that's an option here in America, or all these things too, or like how we dress, or like reflect on my own clothing then when I hear that. And this really doesn't happen. We have to be very specific about this. And so when we want to teach intercultural competence, we have to start, I think, before we even get into the language aspects or anything else, with what is culture. And then what is our culture, if we even have one? What is intercultural competence? Like, for instance, more specifically, what changes when we cross from El Paso to Ciudad Juarez, because there's this fixed border in our minds, but also then what stays the same. Because, again, it's not something that changes once you cross a border. There's more that's actually shared. And then students start to see these borders as fuzzy, not just in the sense of like what the foods are, but linguistically too. Like, we speak more and more Spanish the farther south you go, and maybe more and more English once we get to Canada, and I mean, who knows? But the fact that this isn't some kind of one homogenous nation, state, culture, period, that we move back and forth across these things. So intercultural competence, for the purposes of this talk, we could spend all day talking about then, okay, fine too, culture, what's intercultural competence? A person's ability to communicate competently within and across linguistic cultural boundaries, and adapt to the interlocutor's cultural style to work out the most conversational, social, and politeness strategies which are essential for effective communication. And these are borrowed again from other people, not my own. So when I first was hearing about this, like, I made this face because I realized that I can't do this in English. Like, necessarily communicate and understand somebody else's nonverbals with me and these issues. So if I have issues in English, in my native language, communicating, what am I supposed to do in Arabic? Which a language is not my mother tongue and that kind of thing. So this, to me, is really the ultimate thing, because we need to be able to teach these pragmatics of a conversation first in our own language, so that students can really actually then apply it to a different one, a new one that they're learning. Because if we don't have a handle on how we're communicating, or how we may be seen, or how we're perceived, or how we perceive other people, and learn how to do this with our own conversations, when we add that extra layer of language and just understanding what's being said, then we have to be able to know how to apply that other layer of understanding like really what's happening in this conversation. So in that spirit, moving along, what's conversation analysis then? And spoiler, it's not just analyzing conversations, okay? I got a very angry email from somebody saying, like, you better know everything about this official thing that is called conversation analysis with bold C and bold A. So I took this from this presentation from Kevin Garcia Cruz, who did this workshop at the Intercultural Competence Conference. I was like, can I share with other people? And he's like, yeah, go ahead, because it's Spanish, and so I thought, more people would be interested in this very definite work that you've done. So conversation analysis, this is what came out of this workshop. It's a research methodology that originated in sociology in the 1960s, and it analyzes naturally occurring language data to observe how language and culture are involved in that interaction. And so research shows that the organization of specific utterances, so sequences, turns at talk, taking turns speaking, that kind of thing, which I'm so terrible at in English because I tend to want to dominate the conversation, it appears to be culturally variable. And also individually variable as well, I think, too, because we don't all communicate the same in English. So interaction is culture, is what he says, or what Beth Hudson, she says. It's not only evident in words and text, but in the back and forth of verbal and nonverbal interactions. So previously, whenever I taught language in Arabic, it was, this word means university. Jamiat is university. Jamiat is mosque. And heaven help you if you get them confused. But it's more than that, just the vocabulary is the language. It's all these other ways that we use that vocabulary to communicate with each other. This is what we hope to do. So I borrowed this from as well. Like, when we think about teaching a language, it's not just the speech acts, which is what we tend to get stuck in as language teachers. It's the grammar, it's nuts and bolts, it's how you pronounce the hot or that kind of thing. But it's more than that. It's interactional patterns, like, how do you leave? How do you open a conversation? Sociolinguistical aspects, aspects, cultural norms, expected behaviors. And it's not enough just to tell students, don't shake somebody's hand, wait until it's offered, without knowing why or the reasons behind this. And not everybody's gonna act like that either if maybe they don't follow that particular brand of religion. So we have to keep all these things in mind too, when we want to teach language, and it can be awfully difficult. So for me, we can talk about theory all day long, but I think it's sometimes better to have like a concrete example. So there's a handout on invitations in Spanish, refusing and pursuing acceptance. If you'd like one.
Yes.
Need it. You want? So then again, this is all from the workshop, and I did none of this work. This is from Kevin Garcia Cruz. So the idea, like, what blew my mind completely is that he started off in English, because we're sort of trained in many ways. You have to stay in the target language, or you're not really learning all the time. But sometimes it's okay to address things in English. We did this in Arabic, and I thought it was this new thing that nobody else does. But now other people are doing it too, but from a different angle. So, like, how do you decline an invitation to an event in your first language? And the nice thing about this too is that he's not assuming that your first language is English. So, if you think about this, how do I say no if somebody's asking me out to someone? How do I get out of this situation? What do I say? How do I do it? And then, do you expect the inviter to insist that you attend? Like, what's your expectation? And then also, if you invite somebody else, what do you do after hearing somebody rejecting your invitation? I was talking to a coworker and I said, I've never thought about this before, and they were totally shocked, like that I'd never analyzed my own conversations like this. But it's not my personal wavelength. I just exchange information and live in my own head too much, I guess. But actually walking students through this in their first language can really help get at them what's going on in the language that you're trying to teach, because this is the nuts and bolts of it. So he has, like, step one, listen to the following conversations, and then select information that best corresponds. You can decide for yourself if this is like the best way to teach that kind of lesson, but let's listen to the English together, because he includes an English example. And I talked to him, he said he doesn't do this for every lesson, but so many of them, not this one. This is, by the way, Indiana University of Bloomington has all these examples of speech acts and different things, and it's all for free. Only in Spanish though, and in English. Right, here's the English one. Here we go.
Hey Tyler, how's it going?
This is English, Tyler, and Ben.
Man, no kidding. I'm so glad I saw you, man. Yeah. Check this out. Next weekend, on Friday night, 8 o'clock, my 21st birthday party at my house.
Oh,
man.
no way.
The whole crew's gonna be
Oh,
there.
that's
It's
gonna be
gonna be
awesome.
It's gonna be the bomb.
Oh, that's gonna be
gotta
so
show
cool.
up.
Oh, what day is it again?
Friday, 8.
Friday.
At my house. Dude.
Oh, dude, I'm going out of town this weekend.
Oh man,
Yeah.
you gotta stick around. It's my 21st.
I know.
A big day.
I know.
It's gonna be the best.
Man, okay. I just, I got this great deal on like a flight, and I'm going out of town to see my, my family.
Oh man, I
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah, but maybe let's make some plans. Let's get together. I'll take you out for a drink.
Okay.
All right.
Cool.
Okay. So we can see how artificial it is in this English example here when he talks about, like, how does Bend extend the invitation? You can clearly see because it's in English. It seems obvious. So whether or not that's the best thing for you to do in your own language classroom, I read this to you. But sometimes it is helpful, anyways, to really see what's happening in this conversation, and also too, like, the understood element is that the 21st birthday is the one where everybody gets drunk. If you maybe didn't grow up in America, you wouldn't make this connection. But these kinds of things. And then so Spanish, it gets a little bit more tricky because it's that's the target language you're trying to teach. Asking these same questions. How do they extend the invitation? How do they refuse the invitation? And I don't want to play it here, but it's in the same website that they go through. So that's just like step one. So they have the initial reflection, and then phase two is the analysis of the structures, which is actually given to them by the instructor themselves. So we don't ask the students, hey, analyze this. It's very, very guided analysis. And then you also have discuss the following questions, differences and similarities, because then you're making these connections with people. Did I pull this one up? Here's a reprisal video. I'm not sure if this is the same one. So, again, what's really interesting to me about when I received this is how specific this instructor is being with comparing the differences and similarities, really making students analyze them, really getting into it, including English examples. And then, which type of refusal, direct or indirect, is more accepted in Spanish, what about in English? These things that go further than just the language uses itself, no, la, whatever it is in your target language, but how are you using that? Are you going to be perceived as being rude if you don't do these things? So conversation analysis includes also, in phase 3, like, all this interaction is written out for us, and I asked the instructor, like, did you translate for them? He says, no, this part isn't translation, it's just for purposes of showing people, because not all of them speak Spanish. But the students themselves would listen and actually transcribe the conversation, and fill in these ideas. And then you ask the following comprehension questions based on the dialogue. I think so much of language instruction at least in Arabic, which lags behind other languages in second language acquisition, but comprehension questions, like, did you understand? Which has its own issues, but it is like if you filled it in yourself, then you're really getting at the meat of the conversation. Some people very much disagree with this, and transcription doesn't equal understanding, but it's a matter of personal opinion, I suppose. And then after class, when they're following comprehension, not just writing it, but making sure you understood it, and then going through the dialogue transcription to become familiar. So how does line 5, like, what does she say this in order to show interest or disbelief or accept? It's not just understanding, like, that she's saying how cool, but it's the way that she's using it. So really no stone is left unturned. And then they go on to, these very, very, very specific questions that the instructor asks students to look through. And it's like a page and a page of this. And then after doing all of this analysis, students are expected to mimic a conversation similar to this, using what they learned. So all in phase 4, the student receives a card with information about an event for which they have to extend or accept an invitation. So what you're doing is you're going around the classroom trying to find the person who's got your same event. And if you've mismatched events, you have to learn to refuse their invitation. So you practice not only giving somebody else an invitation to an event, but also accepting it as well, or rejecting it more potently, because all these examples here are about rejecting invitations. So you have to walk around the classroom inviting different students until they find the person who's got the same invitation, and then you practice that in the classroom, and then the homework is to reflect. What are some elements? And again, the assignment is in English upon reflection. They specifically ask you, what did you learn? Is there a preferred way of extending, rejecting things in your native language, whether it's English or anything else, and then comparing that to the target language. So it's a lot of English, which is a no-no in many aspects, but if we're really trying to get to the heart of intercultural competence, sometimes things break down that we don't realize. Like the student, I didn't understand that. I thought she just didn't understand my question, like, what is your favorite museum to go to? Because that's actually a tricky thing to say in Arabic. It was just that she'd never actually been to a museum, and she lied. So there's no more communication. Or I think about this too in Arabic, for instance, how when you offer somebody food, you have to say no, like in Arabic culture, and whatever that means. Generally speaking, across the Middle East, if somebody says, here's some cookies, like if I were a Middle Easterner from Yemen, I wouldn't eat them. Like I would expect you to offer them to me, and I'd still say no, and then we'd have to do this dance that lasts several minutes of you saying, no, you have to eat these, they'll go in the garbage if you don't eat them. I really insist, and back and forth. In America, it's like, no, I don't want them. It's like, okay, then we're done. But unless you were this with an Arabic person from that background, they'll probably be sitting there staring at the cookies like, cookie's so bad, but it'd be so rude to take one. And maybe we understood everything perfectly, but we didn't really communicate. So these very simple things when it gets to like, accepting or rejecting an invitation, it actually gets quite tricky because it's more than just saying no, bye. Sure, you rejected it, but you might be seen as incredibly rude in that sense. So this is the entire lesson plan in Spanish. Okay. But then here's the problem, right? Once we start to, so we've already got a body of work that we have. And so it's hard to know then, okay, we want to analyze conversations. We realize how terrible our textbooks are. Because a lot of our textbooks have these inauthentic conversations. And this is particularly, I think, the case for less commonly taught languages. It's easy to find things in Spanish in some ways. I don't speak Spanish, so I feel like I'm not alone saying that. But even the Pragmatic Institute, all their examples are in Spanish and in English. So it's harder, I think, in other languages. So I typed out this one, as we can see on this page. This is from our textbook that we're getting away from. And let's watch the conversation. Oh wait, this is, sorry, the wrong one. I opened up 11T1, which is basically the same, but not exactly. Here we go. Yeah, se ha aterrizado, this like, oh my god, oh my god.
الو ازيك يا
So
امل؟
how are you, Anna?
ازيك يا رنا؟
How are you, Anna?
ازيك يا حبيبتي؟ اخبارك ايه؟ الحمد لله كل شيء تمام. سمعتي الاخبار؟ اخبار ايه؟ خير ان شاء الله.
It's only a
كان
good
في
news
حادثه
update.
النهارده الصبح.
There was an accident this morning.
حادثه ايه؟ فين؟
Where?
حادثه مرور في وسط
Traffic
البلد.
accident.
عارفه فين وزاره الخارجيه؟ ايوه هناك. الحادثه قريبه قوي من وزاره الخارجيه. قالوا في 5 ماتوا و4 راحوا
They said 5
المستشفى.
people died and 4 people went to the hospital.
في ناس مجانين في السواقة وكمان بيقولوا في واحد مات هو وبنته. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله.
So my
فعلا خبر
total
إذاعة.
strangers in this other reacting.
والله أنا زعلت قوي. الله يرحمهم. طيب حبيبتي أشوفك بكرة. عاوزة حاجة؟ سلامتك. الله يسلمك. لا إله إلا الله. محمد رسول الله.
Okay, so when I first saw this conversation, I thought, okay, great, because they're using all our vocabulary and they're getting into saying goodbye, because in Egypt, you do end with saying the Shahada, which is one person says there's no God but God, and the other person says, and Muhammad is his prophet. I didn't know that when I first went to Egypt. Somebody said, okay, there's no God but God. It's like, sounds good, bye. That's not the proper response. But, so I was like, oh, this is great. But then if you really analyze this conversation, it's really strange. And I think even just reading the English, we can see instantly, like, there was a traffic accident. Do you know where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is? Like, obviously that's just some vocabulary in the chapter they're trying to shoehorn into this conversation. And also maybe directions. It's close. And then, like, also the chapter is about dealing with death. And so 5 people died and 4 people went to the hospital. And, but also culturally too, people die in traffic accidents a lot. So it's really weird that she would call up her friend to talk about, unless she knew somebody in the accident, like, where did you hear this news and why would you call and then be so upset about it? I mean, it's always sad when people die, I don't mean to be cynical. But in a place like the Middle East, where protests are going on now and where people are dying because of these horrific regimes, it's just such a strange conversation to have. And at the end, they're like, well, I was really upset, I'll see you tomorrow. Like, it's inauthentic. And so it does its job in some ways, but in other ways, very, very poorly. Because also, too, the people that we see here are these middle-aged women, and that is 0% of our student population. Maybe occasionally we'll get something, but it's a weird example, and it's not likely to happen in this way. So we want to give people authentic texts that they're actually going to then use, and not just these artificial ones. But then the problem, okay, where do we find this information? So, right, so here's some sources for clips. Because we want to have authentic clips. I can send everybody this information. There's of course YouTube, which we all know about. Lumiere at Berkeley, do you use this? Because it's an amazing resource that takes all these movies and you can get clips from the movies and pull them out. You can't mash them up together because I was hoping to mash up like a bunch of readings and that kind of thing from different movies, but they're still working on that part.
Is that different from the Berkeley?
It's the same thing, they just migrated it to this new platform.
Okay, I didn't know that.
It's had its hiccups, but so if you use it, we have access to it here at UNM. And if you want a movie that they don't have that you know of, they're very receptive to buying it and helping you get that up there.
Or if they have a movie that UNM doesn't have, we can buy the movie.
Yeah. Or vice versa, if like we really want a movie that nobody has, like we can contact people at Berkeley and they're great. They've been really great. And so you can even show home movies using this. legally, which is also fantastic.
I don't know how they get away with that. I really want to ask that guy.
I don't know either, thank you.
I think they're just taking a chance.
It's really quite something. I think it's under this, I mean, they really clamped down on it now, like, what are you using this for? Who do you need it for? What class is it? And why? And I mean, they're getting more specific. So you just be like, I want this movie, and you're like, here's the clip, or here's the film. But here's the issue with movies, or just because we find it out there and it's in Arabic for Arabs by Arabs doesn't necessarily make it authentic, right? Because not all movie conversations are authentic. So I have a 3-minute clip in English that I will absolutely make everybody watch, just to really drill my point home, again in English. And it's saying goodbye in movies, because you'll notice when people hang up on the phone in movies, you never say goodbye. Right?
Excuse me. Yes, sir. I understand. Don't go outside or even to the restaurant. I'll have a car there in a hot minute.
Okay.
Okay. And no booze today, Howard.
No booze.
Well, hell, I can't wait that long.
20 minutes? Fine. Okay, 463. You just let me know if you don't leave town.
Okay.
Okay.
Asiento.
Okay, but be careful, don't let anybody see you.
It's an emergency. I'm in a phone booth.
All right.
Yes, I understand.
I'll drop by. Okay, Noah. Go ahead. Shoot as you can.
What would I do without you, Pauline?
Make sure you pick it up. All right, well, all right, we'll see you.
I'll be home soon. I love you too.
Love you, pal.
I love you too.
I love you.
Love you too.
Is it too late to say I love you?
It's early.
I'll pick it up later, all right?
All right, I'll be here till 6.
Good.
Okay, I'll be ready. Bump everything out to condition red and stand by tomorrow. I'll get back to you.
Yeah, I'll be at practice. Yeah, right. Okay.
I'll put a couple of sticks on the hood.
Let me see what I can do. I'll get back to you.
Sure, I guess that's all you can do. All right, I'll get back to you later on.
No, that's it, Ross. Put it to bed. Right?
Yeah, as soon as you can.
I'm away. Okay, I'll be right over.
Get at my place right away.
I'll give her the message.
They'll be totally discreet. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. All right, yes, thank you very much.
We'll see you soon.
Thank you. You better get yourself a godly t-shirt, buddy. Or it's your funeral.
Okay. So here we have, if I was a non-native English speaker, I would see this selection of amazing clips from all genres of movies from all time frames, from the 50s up till now, and think, okay, Americans just don't say goodbye. I mean, and these are all authentic clips because they're all from movies by Americans for Americans, but there's a rule, and if you ever take any screenwriting classes, that if you write a screenplay, you can't have any dialogue that doesn't advance the plot. And because goodbye doesn't advance the plot, it's got to go. So, and so, I mean, I think movies, we're stretching the limits of our imaginations more so now than we used to, but if you, now you see, you can't unsee. Every time you see a movie, people will hang up at the strangest times. I've never in my life thought to myself, okay, I love you, click. I mean, like, it's almost, maybe I was studying something. But, so we have to be careful when we select our own clips because they don't necessarily reflect reality. And we all know this about Hollywood and everything else, but somehow we forget this when we teach languages. So like, oh, hooray, a clip that I found that's authentic that my students can understand. But it's got to be more than that if it's true intercultural competence. Or at least, point out in class that this is really inauthentic. So, also we just watched this one. And this is what I call the Chinese problem. So I was at a different conference and somebody brought up like intercultural competence, and I don't speak Chinese, but they said nobody in China says ni hao, say hello. As soon as you say that, you know you're speaking to an American or somebody who's learned Chinese as a second language, because there's actually 20 different ways to greet people in Chinese. And depending on social status or the meaning or what's going on. And so then people in the entire presentation got derailed talking about all the different ways to say hello in Chinese. So the question was then, if that's not how people say it, then why is that what we teach? The argument was we can't spend an entire semester teaching people to say hello, you'll never get anywhere. And then the counter argument was, but don't we want to teach our students authentic language as it's actually being used? And isn't this a part of intercultural competence, to say hello in a proper way? So these are struggles that we, I mean, I don't, is that even true? I don't even know. Does anybody know?
I think so, yeah, partially true that, I mean, they also will bring up the kind of a situation to learn hello in English.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and when if I can recall, when I started to learn English, the first lesson was, how are you? But when I really get into the English-speaking countries, and very, very rare, I wasn't greeted as how are you? Yeah, a lot of people say what's up, and then I can look up, there's nothing up there. So ni hao is not usually used for a lot of Chinese people. That's, I would say, yeah, true.
Because this totally blew me away. One Chinese I knew, I guess not. I mean, and this is the issue too, and then of course in every language there's more than one way to greet people. And this changes over time, and who you're speaking with, and you know, the youth and the elderly, and who are you and where do we fit into this puzzle? This is all a part of it, and so what's really authentic then too? And then I had started to like think, I don't think I've ever had an authentic conversation in my life, you know, like all of these things, because what do we do when we have a conversation, and what does it mean to have that? And so this is where conversation analysis really comes in, is that we analyze how we actually communicate in our native language, whatever that may be, and then we can carry that over to how we communicate in another language, and then hopefully carry all of that forward to be better communicators in general, because learning another language means to not just learn the vocabulary or the grammar, but actually communicate your thoughts. Conversation analysis is one way to do this. So where do we go from here? Again, the biggest problem is finding clips that are appropriate. So my best advice is to do things little by little. We're slowly getting rid of this abominable textbook, but it took us years. And next year will be the first year that we'll have finally moved away from it. But I am having weekly freakouts about it because there's no materials that are really accessible for students. They're out there, I just can't fathom the amount of time it's going to take to hunt them down and then put them into a sizable clip for students to then digest. It's going to take a long time. And not just conversations, but printed word and everything else too. But it's not impossible, I think we can do it. We've gotten there in Arabic with our second and third year and that kind of thing. We don't do official conversation analysis because we don't have students transcribe conversations. We do sometimes a talk abroad, but I wouldn't call this conversation analysis necessarily because we don't follow all the rules and the laws. But I think there are things that we can take away from this, and maybe transcription is something we'd like to do, to pull it out and then find ways that in which we communicate and learn how to communicate with others all over the place. So we have some time left, which is good because I thought we could have time to work on whatever it was that you might want to work on, like look at your own clips or that kind of thing, or have any questions.
Thank you very much.
Welcome. Always useful.
Yeah, it is. Is it possible that I can email you? You can send me the slides? Because I find some of the slides with the resources and the links are very useful. Okay, I'll email you later.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, because that's why I put them on the PowerPoint, so I could have a spot to give them to other people if anybody was interested.
Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure, and there might be an actual whole lesson plan in Spanish, but I'm still waiting for them to get back to me about that. Thank you for sharing your resources.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
And thank you too. Yeah, I arranged this presentation. Usually I have a classes to go, and today, this semester I co-teaching with that's why I don't have a classes today. That's why I couldn't come.
Oh, that's good.
Right.
Right. The co-teaching is amazing. We do this in Arabic, and it has been fantastic for us. I was kind of like, I don't know how this is going to work at first, but
How does it work?
students, they are excited.
Yeah.
Very, very excited. Whenever come to the dialogue, the students always want me and Hong to kind of do the role play. And some of the students would like to video record the conversation between us. So, yeah, it's interesting.